CNN's Fareed Zakaria, GPS, editor-at-large at Time magazine, also Jill Doherty at the State Department, and senior political analyst David Gergen. Jill, what's the view inside the Obama administration? Could Iran turn into the next Egypt? They're clearly being very aggressive in their public statements about Iran.
They are, but Anderson, they are very realistic about the fact that Iran is a different ballgame. You just talked about it. It is extremely repressive. The level of repression is much higher, actually, than it was in Egypt and almost anywhere. They are executing, they are torturing, they are rounding up people. So realistically, to think that something could happen that easily, there's no illusion, I think, here. That said, there is that tide of people's movements that is definitely sweeping. You just showed the map, sweeping that region. And so by saying that perhaps the same thing, the people of Iran should take the same rights that everyone else is entitled to, could be a very powerful message. Also, don't forget, after the 2009 election in Iran, the United States did not speak out very forcefully, very quickly, and now it is. So they are changing. They're being much more aggressive.
Fareed, the hypocrisy of the Iranian regime, though, is pretty extraordinary for them to be praising the Egyptian protesters and then cracking down on their own.
Well, it's extraordinary, Anderson, because what this was in Egypt, this remarkable revolution, was at core a revolution about young people, their access to the world, their access to the new technologies of connectivity, right? And people have called it the Facebook revolution, and maybe that's an exaggeration. Here's the important thing to realize. There can be no Facebook revolution in Iran because Iran blocks access to Facebook. It blocks access to all such social networks on the internet. So Iran is really trying to maintain one of the oldest tricks of a dictatorial regime, which is isolation, autarky, intellectual autarky. Hope that your people don't know what is going on outside, and hope that as a result, they will simply not be able to access the kind of means of connecting with one another and organizing. It is a very strange way to maintain control in the 21st century, but in Iran it is still the playbook that the regime uses.
And David, we're seeing now demonstrations pop up in other places, all of which, each country is different, and it poses real challenges for the Obama administration. In a place like Yemen, there's two battle zones going on in North and South Yemen. There's a real al-Qaeda influence there. So obviously the administration, which has now been cooperating quite closely with the government there, has real concerns about seeing that government overthrown.
Absolutely, and that's why you don't find the Secretary of State encouraging the protesters in Yemen. And if anything, the United States is trying to keep a focus on Iran. And I think what's striking here, Anderson, is how different the U.S. response is to the protests in Iran today than where we're back in late 2010, 2009, which was just a short while ago after those phony elections there. People were on the streets. The United States, in effect, punted on that, didn't want to get involved. But now the two things are happening. One is the United States is making, with Israel, apparently making progress in sabotaging the centrifuges, sabotaging their nuclear program, delaying it. But secondly, if the United States can see these protests repressively put down in Iran, it could drive a wedge between Iran and nations in the Arab world, which, as Fareed would tell you, is, as protesters are sort of demonstrating against repressive governments, they could easily turn against the government in Iran and further isolate Iran and maybe help to undermine and bring down that regime, which would be the United States would very much like to see fall.
And Fareed, the U.S. now, I saw they're starting like a Farsi language Twitter service. Clearly one way they're hoping to use social media to try to motivate change.
Well, I think that this is all part of a strategy. David is exactly right. This is part of a broader strategy. I don't know that any of us understands whether or not you could bring down the Iranian regime. The regime does have its own sources of support, but it puts the regime on the defensive. And it's exactly the point you made, Anderson, at the beginning. They have been lauding what has happened in Egypt and yet repressing the very same kind of activity. If this allows the United States to go on the rhetorical offensive, the ideological offensive, and it does feel like a different moment. I think that the United States a year ago, looking at the Iranian protests, felt that there wasn't, part of being conducting foreign policy is figuring out which way the winds are blowing, because you don't actually have the ability to change history as much as you might think. But it does appear that now the winds are blowing in a different direction, and the administration might be able to ride those winds and push the Iranians to, at the very least, feel embarrassed, awkward, and humiliated in front of their own people who are clearly demonstrating against what is still a very, very repressive regime.